you can see how bad the film is. It's not like anyone at this point would argue that I had manipulated the footage in any meaningful, purpose-altering way. You can see the film, and this is what you get. What's acutely frustrating about it is you could probably feel the emotion. These people may legitimately be confused as to being what transgender is, but it can't be glossed over that they also lie and misrepresent things in order to make a case for themselves. Nothing they cobbled together could adequately account for the fact that they just, really don't like you. Not for nothing, I didn't know about this film until I saw a clip of some interviews in 2022 and didn't begin really looking things up until about mid-September. I knew in December I'd want to make a video essay about it, but didn't get started until April of 2023. Needless to say, I'm very, very late to the party throwing my hat in the ring. There are a lot of content creators out there with a lot more financial stability and subscribers than I've got who've already given their fair shake on the movie, ending up on, basically the same side of the fence they started on. The film, again, just isn't substantive enough to actually change minds. People who know more about the subject or, have lived it weren't going to have their minds changed by Miriam Grossman giving Matt Saddle lady eyes. And no matter how much research or explanation you'd give, people who went into the movie agreeing with Matt, in my experience, walked away with little more than an affirmation of their biases. It's not conducive to critical thinking. Look guys, it's very simple. 2 basic genders and we all have to share. I did describe the film as a gish gallop, and I don't want to reduce the sheer size of the film to that one label on its own, because while semantically accurate, this label just doesn't quite do the numerical values justice. I had to stop the film at least 93 times in order to clarify a point or debunk a claim. I counted them out for you for the ease of comprehension. And, for a film that's supposed to be a documentary especially, but just a movie with a pretty average movie-length runtime, this is way too many questions left unanswered for only an hour and 30 minutes. There is no way this was by accident.
Can you tell me about the procedures that you had?
What is a woman?
What is a woman?
The sheer density of things is conducive to a lack of critical thinking. Most documentaries tend to explain a complex point by allowing it some room to breathe. Give it even just a brief section of the video dedicated exclusively to illustrating the concept. Then, applying its relevance to the rest of the film, allowing an attentive viewer to call back to things they just learned mentally in order to understand new information and or solidifying their comprehension on the old stuff. What is a woman doesn't do that. They call back to things in a more literal sense, which isn't really a good idea. I get the way they structured it. They kind of ease you in with a few fairly soft interviews. Then, around the heavier topics, call back to those initial interviews for information that's materially relevant here. The problem with that structure is a lack of grasp on time. By the time Scott's done talking, you forget that what Matt's asking Marcy Bowers about here is a different surgical procedure, and so these two scenes aren't actually materially relevant to each other, but the subjects are similar enough that you may forget or just assume they're the same. I honestly forgot that they even put Patrick's interview near the beginning of the film, because I felt like it was a midpoint kind of thing, which was the pivot from interview to interrogation. And I get why they structured it this way, again, even if just for honest reasons. But this is closer to how you structure a narrative, not actually relevant information, because the chronology is important to its comprehension. Okay. But we're back to the numbers game. With this bizarre structure and so many things to say, it's very easy to give in that some of the assumptions are correct. We live in a society, for instance, where we can just kind of take for granted that women's sports are a necessary category, which even Neil deGrasse seems to kind of assume.
This only matters because today we segregate most
nearly all sports by gender.
I thought that too, but it turns out the history on that is a little convoluted. Jessie Gender did a great review of the film, and in it, she summarizes kind of the history behind women's categories and things.
Many sports that didn't actually have a women's category at all, and women were allowed to compete freely against men. And many women started to beat men. Take, for example, Madge Sivers, who came in second place in the World Figure Skating Championships in 1902. But because this woman suddenly started beating men, this caused women to be banned from figure skating championships in 1903. Arguments around this eventually led to the creation of a women's category for figure skating in 1905. This category was created under the argument that women were weak and needed a separate category so they didn't have to face all the men, despite women kicking men's butts when they competed against them in certain cases.
In short, it's basically just another antiquated way of segregating people we don't like being with. And that's something I can understand the What is a Woman creators taking for granted themselves. But that's unfortunate because they still hinged their arguments on that. If your goal is to discriminately remove an entire margin of people from sports, which ironically and coincidentally was the point of making women's categories to begin with, you're gonna need some actual justification for that. And their reasoning is packed onto the load-bearing cause of an understandable but flimsy inference. I don't want to make it sound like males and females have no biological differences. It's just that rather than being a solid divide, there's a confluence of characteristics meshing them together and drifting them apart. Males, for instance, trend toward a higher bone mineral density, giving them an undeniable advantage when running, swimming, throwing, or lifting. But that advantage is indiscernible in competitive categories where everyone's putting in massive amounts of effort and you need to have been on HRT for a full year prior to qualifying, but yeah, the difference is there. It could also be mitigated by, a high calcium intake diet, but that's not nature, that's something you influence yourself. The video I saw, which introduced enough to me to make it clear it was something I was going to want to research, was Matt Walsh responds to journalists' review of What is a Woman. Matt responds to the LGBTQ Nation piece from journalist Aaron Rook called The Dangerous Deception of Matt Walsh's What is a Woman. It's a response to the film which highlights a few things, most of which were pretty obvious to me, but also took note of something I just sort of accepted at face value without looking into, which was that the Maasai tribe, despite being rooted in traditional Christian values, does have non-traditional gender roles in their social culture. Who knows what else I could have taken for granted if not for these kinds of pieces, so thank you, Aaron, for that. Now, I want to touch on something here. The density of lies is very cautious. There's a point early on in the Dawn Suker interview, you'll remember, where Matt refers to the councilwoman Dawn picked a fight with. He says he, then corrects himself with this individual. He obviously knew how to refer to her, but didn't explicitly go with male pronouns, right? Why did he do that? In his responses to Aaron, I thought something was kind of fishy because while Aaron is a gender-neutral name, it is pretty dominantly female-oriented. And he does refer to them as a she, but something about that thumbnail with a pleasant-looking nerd on the front of it threw me off. I went to LGBTQ Nation's site to see more about the author, but it had a different image. I contacted Aaron on Twitter. He says, "Hi there. Yeah, that's me." He grabbed the photo that was on my Facebook account at the time, and yes, he misgenders me. Okay, so Matt Walsh will just lie to his audience so casually about people's pronouns that a normal person observing the thumbnail has to ask what happened. There was some talk in that video about Dr. DeJean's study. Matt insists that gender affirmation care increases the likelihood of suicide, but doesn't seem to have actually read the study that he claims proves this.
It says, myth. Trans people who medically transition are at increased risk of suicide. And she explains, in an effort to portray gender transition as dangerous, the film includes the assertion that transition makes people suicidal. This claim is likely rooted in a misinterpretation of the research promoted by anti-transgender psychiatrist Dr. Paul McHugh in a 2014 Wall Street Journal op-ed. But the 2011 Swedish study he references was not designed to evaluate the efficacy of gender affirmation surgeries, and its authors caution against such an interpretation. Trans journalist Kristen Williams interviewed lead author Dr. Cecilia Dejing, who expressed her frustration at the ways in which her research had been misrepresented. Quote, "I've even seen professors use my work to support ridiculous claims. I've often had to respond myself by commenting on articles, speaking with journalists, and talking about this problem at conferences. People who misuse the study always omit the fact that the study clearly states that it's not an evaluation of gender dysphoria treatment. If we look at the literature, we find that several recent studies conclude that WPATH standards of care compliant treatment decrease gender dysphoria and improve mental health." Okay, now, the fact that the authors of the study, the Swedish study, were not trying to prove that gender affirmation surgery, quote unquote, big scare quotes around that, increases suicidality, and yet they proved it anyway, only makes the results more compelling, not less. That study, no matter what the authors of the study would prefer or how they'd like us to read the data, clearly shows that trans people are the most suicidal a decade after the surgery.
Because what Matt seems to make of Dr. Dejean's responses to it all is clearly not paid any attention.
This one author, that's not what she was trying to prove. That's not what she set out to do, and yet she proved it. These are results that cut against the biases, apparently, of the people who conducted the study, which just makes the results all the more convincing. The writer never actually says outright that the claim about suicidality is wrong. She cautions against misinterpretation, but does not attempt to refute it because she can't.
That study did not prove that claim. That claim is more than a misinterpretation when you become aware that the author is correcting you as to what that proves. And furthermore, in order to know that Dr. Dejean was cautioning against misinterpretation, you'd have had to read the interview where she also verbally cites the 2010 meta-analysis, which proves that there is a positive correlation between gender affirmation care and quality of life.
In 1999, when I started the Stockholm Gender Team, we were conducting diagnostic evaluations to help trans people start their social and medical transition. Our team included psychologists and a social worker, and we worked in close collaboration with endocrinologists, plastic surgeons, as well as speech and language pathologists at the Karolinska University Hospital.
Williams asked,
"Before I contacted you for this interview, were you aware of the way your work was being misrepresented?"
Dr. Dejean says,
"Yes, it's very frustrating. I've even seen professors use my work to support ridiculous claims. The Huffington Post wrote an article about the way my research is misrepresented. At the same time, I know of instances where ethical researchers and clinicians have used this study to expand on and improve access to trans healthcare and impact systems of anti-trans oppression. A 2010 meta-analysis confirmed by studies thereafter shows that medical gender interventions reduce dysphoria."
Notice how in the 30-year-long study taking place from 1973 to 2003, they still correlated their trans groups to cis-characterized groups by age and sex. No, not by birth sex, but by post-trans sex surgery sex.
Random population controls were matched by birth year and birth sex, or reassigned sex, respectively.
Actual doctors, people studying this stuff, recognize the validity of queer identities. If Matt Walsh expected Miriam, a psychiatrist, to change her mind on her own, then surely the founder of the original study she's trying to cite, who understands the context of the experiment and can read the data properly, whose work this is, can be considered more empirical. I think I speak for the whole of humanity when I say that this film, whichever end of the issue you fell on, wasn't made with education in mind. You weren't meant to learn anything from it without a way to fact check everyone with you. In fact, the most enthusiastic sources of information had to be censored in order to prevent a good point being made. The responses to the film, however, in my experience, didn't acknowledge that. They'd cover the topics of the film and respond to their factual merits, but then just kind of stop there. I'm not transgender, so maybe I'm wrong to throw my opinions out here, but I will have to get to that. Before I throw my opinions on topics not already germane to my knowledge, however, I'm going to tackle a few things I do know for a certain first, and this may risk being a controversial opinion. Sorry, but Aaron Rook, sir, I disagree. This movie is not
Slickly produced.